Welcome to another episode of Procurement Pulse today with Patrick Van Hol. He is a supply chain consultant with Tungsten Automation, as well as the founder of Supply Chain Storyteller, and teaches a graduate level course at the University of Arkansas for supply chain strategy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Freddie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thanks for joining. Really, something I wanted to start with on an almost more personal note is on your LinkedIn, you have a big banner with your name and Supply Chain Storyteller. What does that mean and what is that all about?
Well, I think for me, having been in supply chain for almost a quarter century, 25 years, it's that really, I've seen so many different angles of the supply chain. And I think that the one thing that I've become convicted on is that supply chains indelibly shape the human experience. And so for as much as we can talk about the movement of products and goods and services that occur because supply chains make it all possible, it's really the stories of how supply chain is contributing to all of these things. The medications we need, the foods we eat, the digital services we can't live without, all of those are made possible via supply chain. And so when we start to take that human element into consideration, there's so many stories that go beyond just those simple movements and transactions. It's about the people that are doing the work, how they're integrating processes and technology. And it really starts to become a much richer story than just what it seems like on face value. So that's really the passion that I like to bring to the conversation, is really recognizing the work that's being done by the people doing the jobs.
And I know I'm jumping this on to you, but do you have a little short story that kind of sticks out to you where you are saying, hey, this is really something that envisions or that embodies that idea?
Yeah, I look through some of the stories in my career and I think about the times when things have gone right or that they haven't gone right. And I think that part of what we think about in society, and we certainly talk about there's a concept called gold-plated grit where we celebrate all these things. But the idea here is that there are times when during a planning cycle, I shut down a global mining company because I didn't refresh a pivot table. So being able to humanize the experience of that, but being able to talk through that and be able to explain that, hey, this is something that happened in my career and this is something that I was able to understand. And here's how I've learned from that experience and come forward. It's not kind of the overly glossy experience, but it's really humanizing the things that we get to do. And then certainly being able to talk about those times when we do something right, when an individual on my team goes above and beyond to make sure that a customer has received the goods that they want, or a store is in stock and they've personally made it accountable. Because individually, when we talk about it at the human level, we get that emotional connection to the experience. And that's the thing that people who are doing the jobs and are in search of work, they want something meaningful. And I think that that's really the angle that I like to come at and really talk about those personal stories or those stories of the people that I've worked with or that I've spoken with.
Yeah, I think most prominent what I remember is probably during the time of COVID, right? When there was a shortage of masks, a shortage of medical supplies, and there were people, right, really going above and beyond and trying to get some of that medical equipment, the oxygen and things like that. And I think that's probably when supply chain was front and center, and for a lot of people, right, supply chain for the first time kind of took center stage. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think gets overlooked with that is that when something went wrong, when there was an item missing on a store shelf or a late delivery, supply chain took a lot of blame for that. But considering all of the circumstances that were going on in the world at the time, the fact that we were able to recover and get toilet paper, that we were able to distribute vaccines, that we were able to do all of these types of things, that we were able to get through that. Obviously, it was the biggest disruptor in human behavior in our time. The ability to actually deliver in those extenuating circumstances, we can celebrate that. And supply chain coming to the forefront means that a lot of things happened that made it possible without ever getting the credit that was due. So it gets a lot of blame and not a lot of the credit along the way.
Stories in there that never got told.
Exactly. And you think about it at every level of professions. You think about the medical professions. I've got some friends that were working in hospitals during that period of time, and the ability to move PPE from a contained area into a hospital environment in a timely way that was able to service the needs of their patients. That's an extreme example, but the individuals doing the work to make sure that things were happening, they went above and beyond. They're not getting the credit that they deserve, and not because they want it. This is what supply chain people do every day. But I think that it's prominent enough in society today that we need to recognize the strengths that supply chain brings to the experience.
Do you think supply chain is still undervalued in many companies and still thought of as a service function?
Yeah, absolutely. It changes during points in time. For example, a number of years ago when I was at SEM World, we had data that showed that supply chain was becoming elevated to the level of a strategic equal in the boardroom. But now, when we look at some of those behaviors, it's looking about cost consciousness. It's about tariffs. It's about being able to manage a lot of the processes that underpin this. So supply chain gets kind of stuck in that whipsaw a little bit. And I think that you have the opportunity to really look at it as that linchpin type of capability. And I think about it a lot. What we do now is that when I'm at Tungsten, we think about documents. We think about the number of transactions that are happening. And we think that all the things that supply chains have to manage, we still don't really appreciate the fact that if we could do that better, we can even elevate this further. We still have so much that needs to get done that supply chains just relied on to do the same thing that it's done, but better. And so I think that that methodology and mindset is holding it back somewhat.
Yeah, I remember when I first started with AB 15 plus years ago, it was, the shift was happening then. And I think it happened earlier in some industries, right? Automotive was probably on the forefront of supply chain being a core business function. And then some of the other industries were slowly catching up with some still lagging behind. Thinking of construction, where supply chain is still a lot of times not even a function, right? It gets done by project managers, or the engineers are doing the
Yeah.
procurement side. So, but for us about 15 plus years ago, it really was the transition of supply chain being a service function to trying to establish themselves as a core business function. So we were always told that do good and talk about it, make sure it gets recognized, make sure you bring it up to the leadership, and then they understand and see the value, right? And it's not just done behind closed doors and nobody knows about it. But part of our responsibility was like, if we negotiate a new contract or improved on-time delivery or had year over year savings, that we made sure we had a direct line to the executive team, and they knew about it. So I think that's part of the storytelling, right? Is making sure that there's awareness for what's being done, and also awareness for what the challenges are, right? So if commodity prices are going up and you don't communicate that to the executive leadership team, and they're expecting savings at the end of the year, right? You're going to have a problem if you didn't tell that story of what's going on in the market. So I feel like having that feedback
Yeah.
loop with the executive team, and being able to keep them informed and tell the story of what's going on in supply chain is incredibly important.
Absolutely. And I think the encouragement that you receive to tell those stories, that's a critical first step, because too often supply chains are seen as reactive. And we're talking about the amount of transactions and tactical activities that are going on. And so the motivation to tell the stories falls behind the work to be done. And the fact that you are being encouraged to do that is really important. And one of the things that I think about a lot too is that the ability for supply chains to communicate what they can do and what they can't do is something that's often overlooked as well. So when you talk about the negotiation of commodity pricing, you talk about those capabilities, there's also the point where it says, hey, business, whomever, please stop promising things that we can't deliver, because we're ultimately all going to look bad because I can't deliver on the promises that somebody else made. And I always use the example of Amazon. Anybody's familiar with checking out at Amazon, you see those radio buttons, you can choose which delivery day, what service level you want to receive. But all of those are the supply chain telling the customer, hey, I can deliver on any of these, you get to choose, but I'm not leaving it as an open book, and I'm not leaving it as a commitment that I can't achieve. And so more organizations need to really start to take on that methodology of, here's what I'm doing to drive business value, and here's how I can help us here's how I can make the enterprise successful, but please don't make me do the things that nobody is possible for us. We're not superhuman. We only can work with this context that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, another great experience there. After ABB, I worked for Baker Furniture, very high-end furniture company. They bring in designers every 6 months to create a new collection. And it used to be that supply chain wasn't part of the new product development process, right? Supply chain got in very
Sure.
late, finished products, and said, here, make it happen. Designers can dream up all sorts of different furniture that are possible or impossible to manufacture, right?
Yeah.
They might go very narrow in critical areas where wood alone doesn't do it. So you need to. We had crazy stories of of hiding metal bars within wood furniture to make sure that we could go as thin as they wanted without having to show the metal. So, which obviously drove costs sky high. So, I think another step there for supply chain is right to be involved early in the process. If supply chain
Absolutely.
if supply chain only gets brought in at the very end, you either have costly redesigns or you have some impossible tasks. So for supply chain to have a seat on the table and being part of it from the very beginning of conceptualizing product and having that input and that feedback on what's possible, what are the capabilities of our vendors, can they do what we're trying to do here or not, right? I think was another crucial step for supply chain to become more of a business function than just a service function and having that seat on the table. And I think, again, it all goes back to storytelling, right? Telling the stories of how costly it can be if you're trying to develop a product and you don't understand the capabilities of your vendors, to then only find out that all the work you have done might be for naught or requires extensive reworks. I think, like you said, telling those stories and earning that seat on the table has been crucial for supply chain. And I think
Yeah.
some companies are better than others in that regard.
Yeah. But I think that's one of the interesting pieces about today's place in the world. I mean, you think about product design, you think about process design, you think about all of those things that historically have been siloed. And there have been a number of companies that have tried to integrate those in the past. And I think about Microsoft, for example. They were an early adopter with putting data scientists in the box, so to speak, with supply chain planners. And Columbia, the sportswear apparel company, was very early on with putting product designers in with supply chain planners. And Apple certainly has had very much an integrated process along the way. The technology is changing that. It's really putting people into the conversation, that it's much more integrated and it's much more collaborative in the way that they can work together, as opposed to I do my work, then you do yours, then somebody else does theirs. And if anything changes, we have to start at the beginning. We're now at this place where we can iterate more quickly because everybody starts to see the same picture at the same time. And we can bring multiple perspectives into one lens, and then we can figure out the approach that we want to take.
Yeah, going with that, what are some of the technology interrupters you see that are feasible, right? Everybody obviously talks about AI and what AI can do, but when talking to professionals that are in those roles now, a lot of things seem like it's hype. It's not necessarily they are in the day-to-day functions yet, right? I mean, we have the ERP systems and they've been able to set automatic reorder points, create POs and all of that for a long time now, match invoices, but really I don't think AI for the most part has made it to the day-to-day functions yet. Where do you see that going, and what are some of the most impactful technology changes you are seeing today?
It becomes a matter of the expectation that we set for AI. So I think if we're going into this expecting AI, ERP, cloud, whatever it was, we've looked at so many technology implementations as we're going to have end-to-end excellence and it's never going to waver. But then we start to realize that the conditions that we are working in today weren't what was expected 5 years ago. And so we need that adaptability, but we need to be able to understand some of the things that are being done. So for example, when I think about the processes that we do to manage invoices, we think about the opportunity to reconcile regulatory statements, tariff documents. So much of that's being done with Excel. I've got many stories of those times when I broke something inadvertently because of an Excel file. And I think that if we can talk about the big picture items, and I think that the broad umbrella of AI gets clouded by the fact that what's your AI strategy is a lot like saying what's your math strategy. There's so many different ways that AI can be implemented and what it can be done. But when we start to rethink from an AI first perspective, AI enables us to do these set of circumstances. Now, what does the process need to look like? That's when we can actually start to develop transformation. So if we're not having to manually process shipment receipts, if we're not having to manually aggregate data, if we're not having to do a lot of these things that are really task oriented, we can start to up level the work that needs to be done. And that's the place that I think that still many companies are struggling with, is we're seeing hundreds of thousands of tasks that need to happen on a daily basis. For example, one of the largest shipping companies in the world processes more than 1 million invoices every single day. So if you're trying to do that manually, that's going to cost a lot of money with a lot of people, and you're going to burn people out because it's the same thing over and over again. So how do we start to automate that? How do we start to take some of that mundane, error-prone, inefficient work out of the equation? I think we're overlooking a lot of that, to be quite honest, as we're still trying to chase that big dream of end-to-end perfection without realizing that the work itself needs to be up-leveled so that we can empower our people to get to what that end state is. We're still bogged down in trying to get the job done day to day.
Right. So instead of trying to do it all at once or trying to promise, I think, right, taking pieces where it makes sense and try to automate and plug in AI within those pieces, and then maybe in the end you get a full picture and full pie of all the AI. Do you have any concerns about how they all integrate, right? Because we have so many different functions. Is there going to be one AI solution that does everything, or are there going to be 10 AI solutions that all do a piece of it, but then all still don't integrate with each other?
That's the age-old supply chain question: is can you have one platform that's going to do everything? And so if you look at planning, you look at inventory planning, you look at production planning, you look at logistics and transportation and warehouse, all of those are very specific things that need to be done in supply chains. They have similar tasks that are being done, but there isn't one necessarily engine that's going to be able to do all of that because the specific criteria for each one of them is going to differ. So when you think about agentic AI, for example, you think about doing something on the sourcing side. Great, we can onboard suppliers from the sourcing side, but we also need to look at that from the logistics side. So there's commonality that exists between them, but let's take an agent that works specifically in sourcing and works through the planning, the sourcing, the making, deliver, the negotiations. Let's take one that works in planning or distribution and being able to aggregate that together. Then we can roll that up to a higher level. And so it's not just that we have one agent or one capability doing one thing, but it's about how do we bring all of this together in a way that's actually meaningful. That's the place where I think that we can get to, not just because we're trying to start at that big level that says AI, go fix everything else, but we really need to take that transformative mindset that says, here's the overarching opportunity, but let's see where each one of those tentacles, so to speak, can go down into the supply chain and how do we tie that all together.
So do you think the original or the large ERP systems have an inherent advantage there? If SAP, Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics, if any of them come out with AI tools that are already integrated within their system, right? It sounds like it would be a lot easier to just use their AI tool than trying to go to a third party. They have an AI solution for a specific task, but now I have the problem, right, of how do I integrate that AI tool with my overall larger picture?
If you're an SAP or an Oracle shop, I can see that argument, but we've all heard those stories of the time and cost associated with implementing the ERP of that scale. So I think that that's one of the limiting factors there. I'm sure they can do it. They have the cost structure, they have the size, I'm sure they have the developmental capabilities. But rather than trying to build that out, and it's going to be from the inside out on that perspective, we're still in an environment where best of breed types of environments are going to struggle because you still don't have that connective tissue. And it's really hard to develop that in-house. So you have to either pay for it as a service or you have to pay for it to develop the talent. And so the question becomes, yeah, I'm sure that SAP can look at it, but when you think about the ERPs, you think about the transactional mindset, it's able to connect the data points, but is it really able to drive the insights that are meaningful to the rest of the business? That's going to always be the question, is that connective tissue. And so do you build from the ERP out, or do you build from the business need and then determine the right way to connect those dots along the way? And so it's the build versus buy conversation is very much alive in this case.
What is your feeling? What's going to happen?
I think we're at the place where we've exceeded human capacity to do a lot of the work. I think that we just need to take a lot of the work off the plate of people. I don't feel like we're at a stage where we're going to wholly replace people, because the work that technology does, that AI does, the repetitive tasks, the ones that are going to aggregate data, to be able to connect dots, those types of things that we're still trying to do manually, we don't need to do them. And I don't think that that's meant as a threat. It's saying that the things that are burning people out, the ones that are causing supply chain turnover, tenures in supply chain to be 3 years or less, it's the things that if we can take those off people's plates, that's where we can start to up-level the work, and we can start to be more strategic in the work that's being done. And that's the thing that I think is fundamentally needed across the board. When we think about AI enabled services, it's going after those things that historically have been high cost, high effort to fix with low return. But now we're starting to bring that cost and effort down with these AI enabled services. And now it's at this place where, yeah, the incremental return on each individual instance may be small, but let's multiply that by 1 million. All of a sudden, you've taken this transaction set, you've created massive financial value because you're able to do it better than you were in the past. And so by taking kind of that lower level of the work out and choosing where we want to focus our efforts, you're inherently going to up level the work that needs to get done. And I think that really that's where we need to go. Because if we continue to try and invest at this big overarching, hey, AI is going to solve all our problems, if we don't know what problems to tell it to solve, it's going to go and make up its own solution. It's already hallucinating in our ChatGPT instances, right? So if we don't rein it in from the beginning and we build it from the ground up, we leave ourselves exposed quite a bit. So I think it starts at the bottom rather than the top.
And what do you think happens to supply chain? Let's say, right, we are able to plug AI in where it makes sense, and we're able to free up that time. What do you think happens to supply chain and the people working in supply chain after that?
The point you brought up about Baker Furniture, your story, I think that that's the place where we start to really lean into the creativity of people, to the ability to connect the dots for themselves and to say, here's an insight that I didn't know. And now we empower them to go do something with it. And I think about some of the conversations that I'd had with chief supply chain officers in the past. And for example, one chief supply chain officer, she told me that she had become the bottleneck in her processing because things like shift scheduling were people lower in the organization were afraid to make those decisions. And so it would ultimately escalate with each successive step. And it would come to her and she would say, why am I spending my time doing this? And so we need to be able to set the constraints and the business rules in a way that AI can take care of some of that so that we can then get people to say, okay, here's what I know is possible. And here are the decisions that I have in front of us. Ultimately, we can't make a decision when the condition set is 100 parameters deep. But what are the 2 or 3 things that are most important to our business? And that's how we can start to go drive the decisions. We're not at that place where AI is going to make those decisions for us. It can make recommendations. It can say choose between A, B, and C. But once we get to that level, people will start to feel empowered. People will start to feel educated enough to take a position on what to do. And we get to the point where AI is explainable enough where it can say, this is what direction I chose, and here's why. And then we can learn from it. And I think that that's really the iterative capability that comes about. I think we're now still really focused at this gap between very tactical and very pie in the sky, art of the possible. So how do we start to close those gaps? That's really a fundamental question here.
How do you think, right, people need to adjust to that in terms of how they approach work, right? And I'm thinking about, okay, somebody who today is 80%, 90% tactical, some of that work gets automated. Now all of a sudden they have, just say 20, 30% of free time they used to spend on those tasks. How do they stay relevant? What are the key focus areas they have to pay attention to make sure, right, that the business doesn't say, hey, you know what, you have become redundant, but they're saying, you know what, you provide a different value now.
Yeah. There's obviously going to be the kind of the upskilling question. So part of that with that additional time is how do you become better at prompting? How do you become better on the technical side? And that's a skill set that's evolving, is saying, with the capabilities that are advancing in the time I have, how do I go do a lot of that? I think historically, we haven't been great at organizations to develop those training programs and those cross-functional programs. We've seen attempts at that. There is an impetus that comes on the companies to say, hey, we're going to cross-train you. We're going to help you become more technical. We're going to help you understand different functions of the business. We think about rotational programs, for example, as being kind of early career pieces, but maybe it's the opportunity to become more cross-functional. And we think about kind of the executive skill set, that it becomes more that portfolio of skills. So that's where we're going to need people to take advantage of those new levels of time, the new levels of exposure. It is going to be a bit self-propelled though. And so the conflict's going to arise is, well, if I can do my job in 3/4 of the time, I get 25% of my time back and I'm still getting paid the same thing. Well, maybe I just don't do that extra work. And that's the place where it's going to change, is how do we start to monitor that, not from a big brother perspective, but how do we encourage and empower people.
And I think I actually saw an article. I didn't read it. I just saw the headline. And it basically was like, it's not burnout anymore, it's bore out, where people are bored
Yeah.
at work and they get frustrated because they are bored. They don't get frustrated and overworked, right? They get demotivated and unmotivated because the work isn't challenging anymore and they have free time and they're bored at work. And I think, right, companies, especially in private organizations, we're here in Huntsville, and there's a lot of government contractors, right? So I actually have quite a
Yeah.
few friends who work for some of the bigger companies, Boeing, right, with all those big government contracts. I think that bore out has been happening there for a little bit longer. I feel like those
Yeah.
large contractors have been overcharging on their projects and overhiring. And what I see here, especially in Huntsville, there's definitely some of that going on already. But I think it could, right, with AI enabling people to be more efficient, right? It will take some time, and then I think we might have other entry level roles too that are much more focused on data and AI from the beginning, right? Where you might not hire a tactical buyer anymore, but now you hire somebody whose job it is maybe to work with AI and data from the beginning. So I think our entry level positions might change over the next 5 years as well, right? Because why
Sure.
hire for task oriented entry level roles when those tasks don't exist anymore or
Sure.
exist to a much lower degree?
And it changes the nature of interviewing too. I think some of the questions we talk about behavioral interview of tell me about a time that you worked in a team. That's very general. People can make those things up on the fly. But now it's tell me about a time that you used generative AI to automate parts of your work so that you could do something differently. And so it becomes a much more rich type of evaluation. And there's definitely people that will struggle with that. I think that there is a level of work that will be gone. It's a question of how do we find other work that's there, but it's also going to change the needs of things. If we think about some of the infrastructure questions, the maintenance questions, I think that the kind of the sub industries that come out of a lot of this, we're changing the needs of what is needed from our municipalities and so on. And so that's part of what I think we're going to run into a little bit is that some of those things that were entry level and more basic in nature will go away. But that doesn't mean that work's going to go away entirely. It just means that people will have to find different ways to use their skills. And I think that encouragement almost goes back to the place of kind of early industrial revolution as opposed to saying, hey, we're going to optimize for an assembly line. Now we have to optimize based upon the changing global conditions and how do we start to adapt as things change.
Right, and I think there will be a transition period where there's probably, like, companies haven't quite identified what those new entry level roles look like. They just know the traditional entry level roles is not what they need anymore. So I think there's going to be
Right.
some trial and error on some companies. Right, we've seen headlines might not hire as many entry level roles, which will lead to probably a shortage of leaders in the long run. Some companies might try out new entry level roles, right? And I feel like there's going to be some trial and error over the next couple of years of what's needed, especially in those entry level roles. Where does the task go in terms of, right, utilizing AI and telling the story with data, right? In the end, it comes back to, I think, the storytelling, right? And that's what the business needs. It's like, what do we do with the data? What does the data tell us? And you need people who can tell that story and who can work with AI to make sure the business makes the right decision, right, based on the data and the story it tells.
And I look back and Dell did this a number of years ago where they really went to more of a portfolio based approach for their leadership team. I'm not sure if they still do this, but the idea is that when they aggregate leadership, these are the kind of the must-have criteria, but here are the things that we need to round out. So if you're good at certain things and I'm good at complementary things, but neither one of us overlaps, that actually works because we're able to integrate our skills and our capabilities better. And so I think that we're at that stage where it's not necessarily where you need to have a specific expertise for every single person. You're still going to need a COO or whatever type of role from the operational side. You're still going to need a CFO. That's probably one area that's not really going to change in the short run, but it becomes more so about looking at how do we want people to really aggregate the skills that are going to be important for our business? And so the leadership development, we will see some gap because people aren't going to learn by being in the factories, by building processes, by driving trucks. I think that we're not necessarily going to see those as career advancement opportunities. And it's always been a struggle. AI is probably going to exacerbate that. But we do have this opportunity to look at it more broadly across the entirety of a business and say, what does this business need from leadership? What is the not just individualized persona, but the kind of aggregate persona of leadership within company X, and then trying to fill that out with people and the skills that they're enabled with.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, and I think there's definitely some change coming, right? And I personally don't believe we're going to get to a stage where we need a, what do they call it, a general income or a income for everybody, because AI will have automated everything to the point that nobody's working anymore. But I do think the requirements will change, the objectives will change, and the skills needed to be successful will change. And I do think it's nobody quite knows yet what that looks like. And I think that will take some time to figure out, and there will definitely be some time of uncertainty, right? Where businesses are trying different strategies, and maybe in 10 years we will know what the best strategy looks like.
Yeah, we went through an exercise internally at Tungsten here recently where we were working with a customer, and we took their job descriptions for open requisitions, anything that had the word supply in it, and we pulled out, I think it was 7 or 8 different job titles. And we said, let's look at what is actually being asked of as requirements in these roles. There were a lot of items that were gather, report, audit, and these types of things that when you start to pull back on it is saying, why does that necessarily need to be a human doing these types of things? We still look at these job descriptions and it looks at it, it's like, well, I can go take a piece of paper from my right hand and hand it to my left, but do I need to really be in that transaction, or can we just move it from point A to point B without me being involved? And those are some of the conversations that I think are looming more imminently than kind of the general basic income idea. And some of those pieces is that we're still hiring for the way that we thought it needed to be done in the past, but it just doesn't need to be done that way anymore.
Yeah, I think some interesting times, and definitely changes are coming, and I guess time will tell on where it all ended, how far AI can go, right? I feel like at least those general language models seem to have peaked a little bit. I don't see quite as much improvement anymore as in the early stages, and they're certainly not perfect quite yet. I was working with one last night, and when you get to a certain length of prompts, it starts to forget things, right? It starts, the memory isn't quite there yet. It doesn't know what we had previously discussed or agreed up on. So, and I'm honestly quite glad to see it, because if it would have kept improving at the rate it was early on, I do think it might have been able to eliminate a lot of the roles and a lot of the work that people are doing. But kind of what I'm seeing now is I still do see the need for us to be in charge and give it direction and give it prompts and give it guidelines and structure, because it is not capable to do that on its own. And I think that's a good thing.
No, I agree. I don't think we're at the stage where we want it to be the case. I think the more that we treat it as a relationship, almost as a human relationship, not necessarily in that these applications are
soundboard. It's a fantastic thing to
exactly
to sound out ideas, to get a little bit different perspective. But in the end, if you don't keep it on track, and if you don't give it the structure, and if you don't make sure it stays on task, it will kind of go off the rails at some point.
Absolutely. It's imperfect because the world's imperfect. And so we can't put a rule toward everything, because day by day, especially in supply chain, but with everything, what was important yesterday may not be important today. So if we define something based upon what we thought we knew and that changes, it doesn't work anymore. And so it's really about that flexibility. And I think that we haven't really seen that from kind of the AI and technology side. That's really a human skill set. When we're able to adapt with the changing conditions with technology, that gets a little scary, and we can kind of just turn it off and be told what to do. And well, then who knows what happens with that.
Yeah, let's hope it doesn't come to that, because I have a feeling even if we do, it's going to be vastly expensive and probably not something everybody's going to have access to. The compute power behind it, and it's probably not scalable either, right?
Right.
I ran into limitations of compute yesterday again, where they said, right, even so I'm paying and it's the pro version, you ran out of prompts and stuff because
Yeah.
the amount of energy, the amount of compute power it needs to do all of that and to do all of that at scale, I think limits on what can be spread out for everyone and what everybody can have access to. I think there's probably going to be certain models that are very expensive that can be used in research or very where financially makes sense to do those. But a lot of times I think it's just gonna get to a point where it just financially doesn't make sense to run those tools for invoice matching, right?
Right.
So you're going to still need somebody in the end, a human person, to approve it, to look over it maybe and just glance at it and say, yes, that looks right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there's, when you look at the data that's out there that shows kind of the usage buckets, so to speak, you have some very heavy users that are out there, both from the enterprise and the personal level, but it starts to tail off. And I think we still have an obligation for those that aren't using AI, that don't know, that don't have devices with the capabilities with some of those things. There's a very real risk on some of this, is that, you know, the haves and the has nots will be very divisive. And obviously we're in a state in the world that can be that way. We just need to be careful of that, as well as that the places where it becomes expensive or cumbersome might have consequences that we don't intend. And I think that that's one thing we just need to be aware of.
Thank you very much for joining today. I wanted to give you a chance. If people are trying to find you, where can they find you? And yeah, any what kind of service, if people are looking for a consultant, if you want to give a quick rundown of what you do and where they can find you.
Sure. In my full-time role, I'm an industry consultant for supply chain at Tungsten Automation. And so we're intelligent document processing, intelligent automation. We're doing a lot of work with some of the world's leading companies on that standpoint. From the storyteller standpoint, you can find me at scstoryteller.com. You can find me at Van Hull on LinkedIn. Certainly happy to have those conversations with anybody. And really, every stage of the career, I think that there's stories to be told. And whether it's helping people to do their work better or just simply trying to figure out how to empower people to tell their own stories, please reach out. Happy to have a conversation at any point in time, and certainly happy to be told that I'm wrong is the other part, because that's how we learn. So when there's points to get smarter, and if there's anything that I can do to get better at what I'm doing to help others, then I'm all in.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Freddie.